This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Donald Trump has won the 2024 presidential election amid a divisive political climate. In the coming days and weeks, some people will experience uncertainty, anxiety, and even fear. Today, we will speak to two people having conversations with young people about managing stress during this time. But up first, we're joined by a panel of experts to catch us up on the past few days. Joining us now is Trish Crouse, who's a professor of political science at the University of New Haven. Trish, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Good morning.
And also with us is Susan Raff, who's the chief Capitol reporter for WFSB TV. Susan, thanks for being with us today as well.
Good morning.
And third, on the spot here is Jonathan Wharton, who's an associate professor of political science and urban affairs at Southern Connecticut State University. Jonathan, thank you for joining us today as well.
Thank you. Appreciate being on.
And for our listeners, let us know if you have any questions, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So I'm going to jump straight to it, Jonathan. At the start of this week, we were not sure when this race would be called and how close it would be. What's your initial reaction to what we saw on Tuesday?
Well, that's actually, I'm glad you brought that right out immediately. I thought in the back of my head, and I even stressed this, that we would know who would win this race as soon as the next day, quite frankly. I know you and I spoke about that on Tuesday.
Right.
As a matter of fact, most people thought, oh, there's no way. But I'll tell you why. A part of it was this blue wall. Some of these states were so critical, and they actually learned in the past from what happened in the previous election. And that's key. I'm talking about Michigan. We're talking about, obviously, Wisconsin, and yeah, to some degree, even Pennsylvania. I mean, yes, they had their episodes and issues, but the fact that they came out early and they already made a decision, it was pretty conclusive, and they learned from what took place the last time during the pandemic says a lot. They learned how to actually streamline the process when it came to absentee ballots and what to do about taking in and counting up the votes. I mean, that came out across so many analysis. So I think that's part of the reason why we knew early on what happened. I think that the thing that we learned the most, though, was most striking was the popular vote. That was tremendous. I mean, it was one thing on the electoral count, but on the popular vote, that was quite tremendous in some of these blue wall states especially.
And Trish, talking about the speed was sort of expected. How did the results compare to what was predicted to be at the polls?
You know, I think we need to really hone in our polling skills. I think some of the polls were very accurate, some of them were not. And my problem with sort of basing these judgments on polling is that they do influence voters. So I think we need to do a better job with polling. My expectation was that when all was said and done, again, we were probably going to know the result right away. And I felt that it was going to be Trump because of everything that I had been looking at in the news with the polls and things like that. But you had so many people, that look at these polls and then they say, oh, well, I don't need to vote here because this person is going to be winning anyway. So it's not necessary for me to go out and vote. And I think that we need to do a better job with that. And there's just too many polls. There's too many people putting out polls, and it gets very confusing for people.
Well, I feel like you pointed out a sort of a main theme, I think, this election cycle. There's too many polls. There's too many things going on. And with that in mind, Susan, you were out and about, of course, all day, all week, all Tuesday. What did you hear from Connecticut residents, and what are you hearing in terms of how are they responding to this?
Well, I saw an interesting dynamic that was very similar to 2020. I was in Waterbury covering the 5th Congressional District race and had been following Congresswoman Jehana Hayes, and we were at her campaign headquarters when the polls closed. And I saw a very similar situation that we saw in 2016. People were going in The screen was up. We were seeing some of the results come in the presidential race. And I think people at that point, were watching it closely. And then you could see the mood change. And I remember that in 2016 when Democrats were gathered in Hartford. It was at one point they didn't want to look at the screen because they knew exactly what was happening. I think people knew that this was going to be a close race. But at the end of the day, when it's done and it's over, they realize the finality of it and are now dealing kind of with the fallout.
So it sounds like the realization was very gradual, would you say?
I think it was gradual, and I'm not going to compare it to this, but I will anyway. It's almost like if someone is dying and you never expect them to go, and then they do. And so it is reality at that point. And so now we're dealing with something that I think a lot of people have concerns about. I was with the governor yesterday, the lieutenant governor, the state comptroller, attorney general, all talking about the results, and they had a very close relationship with the Biden administration. And so they are concerned, and it was almost a state of depression, I would have to say, but maintaining that they are going to protect women's rights in Connecticut, which are so vital. As you know, the state's constitution was amended to codify Roe versus Wade, so women would have access to that. Plus, Connecticut also provides services to a lot of women who have been coming here from other states, especially Texas, which has, I think, the strictest laws when it comes to reproductive care. And we do not allow anyone to access records, medical records. So I think they want to reassure people in Connecticut that Connecticut residents are going to be safe and their rights are going to be protected.
And so I want to get into that in a little bit, but first I want to go to Jonathan real quick here. Now that the presidential reality has set in, Trump has made several promises around how he's going to address the economy. He has some promises to extend tax cuts, eliminate some federal taxes, and making housing more affordable. And that's just a couple of things that he's mentioned. Do you expect that he will deliver?
Well, I think he's certainly concerned, as so many people are, about the economy. It's just going to be a matter of specifically what kind of policies is he going to go after first. Executive orders are one thing, at least, Catherine, but I think to respect and understand also the legislative process is going to be critical too. How much is Congress going to be brought into this to deal with it, especially in terms of immediacy? And I don't want to ignore also the Federal Reserve in light of the fact that they're meeting this week, as a matter of fact, I think it's today and tomorrow, about what to do about the interest rate, and even down the line in the next couple of months, because it could be lowered, it could be increased. So there's going to be a lot of things going on. It's like various moving parts going on just at the federal level, and we need to keep in mind that aside from the popular vote and even the electoral vote, electoral college result, there's also the fact of Congress being now both chambers being a unified government. I know everybody's talking about, well, the House could flip. I think the House is going to go Republican. I really do. I mean, the indicators are there. So it's going to be very interesting to see could that be a real possibility across all lines? And then what does that mean in terms of actually addressing the specific policies related to the economy so that the Congress is brought on board? And what leverage are they going to offer for both chambers?
Well, and Trish, with what Jonathan just shared and Susan mentioning earlier about how here in Connecticut, state laws do protect abortion, and we have also expanded abortion access and reproductive rights, but will that be impacted with this change in government?
Well, it will be if everyone goes against their word and says that they are now going to put a federal ban in place for abortion. I don't know how Trump really feels about that, because he's gone back and forth in terms of how he feels about the issue. But you have to keep in mind that a lot of Republican states did pass ballot initiatives to protect abortion rights. So, I think for whatever reason, generally the states voted for Trump, but people in those states decided that they wanted to protect abortion rights, with the exception of Florida. But Florida has a really weird system where you have to have 60% of the vote to approve it. It's not just a general majority. So I do think that those rights will be protected if they decide that they're not going to try to put forth a federal ban. And one point Jonathan made, I know he's talking about unified government, but we have to remember too, when Trump won in 2016, he had 2 years of unified government, and they really couldn't get anything done. So, it's helpful, but it can also be an impediment to actually passing policies.
I think the bigger issue is the Supreme Court. Elections come and go, right? And so if Americans are unhappy in 4 years, they can make a change. But what happens on the Supreme Court is for decades. And there is very strong indication that two justices on the Supreme Court, Clarence Thomas and Justice Alito, may retire. And Trump will obviously elect or appoint a younger Republican to serve. And we saw that in his last administration with a strong majority of conservative justices. And that is something that people need to pay close attention to.
And another topic that's very much top of mind for many people, Trish, is the multiple crises that we're seeing on an international stage. A humanitarian crisis is continuing to unfold in the Middle East and Ukraine and many other places around the globe. How might we expect Trump to act in those spaces?
Well, again, he's made a commitment that he's going to end both of those conflicts. I'm not sure how he intends to do that. But I do think that, you are going to see probably a reduction in funding to Ukraine, probably not to Israel, because generally Congress favors Israel over the Ukraine situation. But I also read this morning that the Biden administration is trying to push through, I believe it's $3 billion in aid to the Ukraine, before they leave the White House, in the hopes of at least giving them, something to help out before the possibility arises that they literally could be cut off financially by the United States. So, I think that both of those crises are going to continue. And I think possibly the one in Ukraine could possibly worsen once the Trump administration takes over.
During this election cycle, I had the opportunity to travel a lot across the state and meet with people. And it's interesting, because you ask people what's important to them and what some of the issues. And a lot of people were not talking about Ukraine or the Middle East. Everyone talks about the economy. And yet the indicators show that the economy is doing quite well. Inflation has come down, the jobless numbers, and some feel that, Trump will inherit an economy similar to how Trump inherited from Obama, that the indicators were there. But I think a lot of people are still struggling as far as are unhappy about the cost of food and certain goods. I wonder sometimes, though, if that should take precedence over some of the other issues that are important to many Americans, which is, reproductive rights, health care, transgender people right now are very concerned. So it's very complicated, I think.
And another challenge that we've been hearing that are concerns for many voters are potential ballot challenges. So before the show, we spoke with Leah Tulin from the Brennan Center for Justice, which is a nonprofit law and public policy institute at New York University. And here's what she told us about potential ballot challenges.
We also were gearing up for and prepared for a lot of post-election litigation, just in terms of, from the pre-election standpoint, we saw more litigation in advance of an election than we've ever seen before. And so we were prepared for that trend to continue. We were very much expecting, if the race, the presidential race was close, to see a similar playbook deployed, or a continuation of that playbook. And because the margins were not close, or were not very close, I just don't expect to see, they got politically and electorally what they were looking for and what they couldn't get in 2020, and what they tried to do through the courts. And so I just don't expect to see that unfold sort of in the counter direction at this point.
That was Leah Tulin from the Democracy Program at the Brennan Center for Justice with New York University. Susan, can you respond to what we just heard from Leah?
I really, it's hard to imagine what's going to happen going forward, I think. And I think that one of the things that Governor Lamont mentioned yesterday, he didn't use the word failure, but he wanted to know what happened to Democrats in the state of Connecticut. They did not turn out in such support as they did with Biden and others, and why that happened. Why did Latino voters who recently were insulted at a Trump rally come out in support of Trump? So I think a lot of people are perplexed about some of the results and what happened here. I mean, obviously Kamala Harris won Connecticut, and I don't think that's any surprise at all, but not as well. And are people feeling disenfranchised in this country, so much so that they are not voting at all or not voting Democrat?
And Jonathan, is that something that you echo too? Any surprises, especially, just want to touch on the 5th District real quick with John Hayes defeating George Logan here in Connecticut's 5th District. Surprised or no?
Actually, that number was amazing because since Susan was on the ground, she probably saw that instead of the 2,000 spread difference the last time around 2 years ago during the midterm race, it was almost 20,000. I think it was 19,000 was the difference. I mean, that was just amazing. But that also speaks to your point, Catherine, about the turnout effect. Traditionally, presidential races have more people turning out, even in a place like Connecticut. And we're kind of unusual. I'm stressing this over and over again as somebody who studies state and local politics, that we're an anomaly because in some localities in Connecticut, the turnout is tremendous, even when it's like local races. I always like to pick out Wethersfield, Glastonbury, West Hartford, where the turnout is nearly double of what the cities are for local races. So in this case, at least for presidential races, yes, it is interesting that maybe it's not the traditionally huge turnout that it could have been or should have been. But one thing to kind of hit on what Susan's offering and add to is that it goes back to the economy. And so many people were affected by this, even in a place like Connecticut. Housing is very costly here. Taxes remain a concern here. I mean, yes, nationally, we might have a robust economy, but we still have our issues, even here in Connecticut, in terms of the problems around our economy, too. I don't want to ignore that. We are an unusual state in that we are wealthy in many respects, but there's certainly a stratification between a lot of groups, a lot of people in a variety of cities, municipalities. Compare Bridgeport, for example, with Fairfield and Westport. It's two different worlds, for example. And that can certainly affect a lot of Latino homes, for example, and African-American homes, for example. And I don't want to ignore that. That's something to be said in a place like Fairfield County as an example.
For sure. And Susan?
Yeah, Jonathan, I think you're right. And, Connecticut has never been a cheap state, right? I mean, it's always been an expensive state to live in. But we have heard, certainly, and this legislative session, housing is going to be a top priority. I hosted or moderated for the Department of Housing, and people just can't afford $2,000 a month. So, yes, I think it's reached an all-time high with people who are just feeling enough is enough. But I wanted to add to what Jonathan had said, and that is I think the spread difference now between Congresswoman Hayes and George Logan is 25,000.
Okay.
Right.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and I think that she really wanted to emphasize that yesterday. We spoke with her at her campaign headquarters because she feels kind of like, everyone keeps saying 2,000 came close. She's like, well, now I didn't come close. I've now been reelected to my 4th term. This is not a fluke. This shows that I'm a good candidate. And, she might be right. I mean, but that is a district clearly that is very purple and is always vulnerable and may always be. But she won much bigger this time around than she did 2 years ago.
Well, I have a couple of questions here before I want to go to break, but Susan, really quickly, according to reporting from our station, voters were improperly instructed not to sign the back of ballot envelopes in North Stonington. So speaking of voter turnout here, and according to the Secretary of the State's office, those votes will not count. Can you respond to some of the problems that we've heard about the ballot boxes, including what we saw in North Stonington?
Yeah, I think, with every election, you're going to have some issues. And I know in North Stonington, there were issues. Torrington as well. And I think one of the challenges, certainly for early voting, if you know, because all of the districts are in one particular location, right? So when you go to vote on election day, you go to your precinct or your district. And some of the election officials may not have known, they have to go through training, right? So that's something that needs to be worked on. It's not fraud. There's no intent to manipulate or change the outcome of the election. They are human error. They need to be addressed. I think the legislature needs to provide more funding for local registrars so that they can roll this out in a better way. And also take a look at, do we need 2 weeks of early voting, especially now that the no excuse absentee ballot passed and has to be tweaked and approved in the legislature. But do we need 2 weeks of that? And mainly because it's a huge expense to cities and towns, and maybe they don't have enough to provide good training for their people.
Well, and on that note, too, for Jonathan, as we've seen, a lot of people turned out for early voting. And can you give us an update on what's the result of the absentee ballots? And as Susan just mentioned, and what will that mean for Connecticut in the future when it comes to voting?
Yeah, and this has been an issue, something I've stressed in the past, even in my own columns I tend to write, is that what kind of stressors this has been on municipalities. And the big debate in the Capitol, which I'm sure Susan was following last year, was, what's the timeline? Was it going to be a week? Was it going to be 2 weeks? They went back and forth, and it was just a volley. I mean, a part of this is that, and this is what happens when you have a new policy that's so transformational like this one in terms of early voting, is we're all learning. There's an entire learning curve between the state government, Secretary of the State, the General Assembly, and on the local side, we can't forget all these registrar voters. And I think many people tend to forget, they're balkanized. And we're dealing with 169 municipalities. We're dealing with all these registrar voters who are partisan, by the way. I mean, we've got Republican and Democrat, both sides representing in many municipalities. So think about that kind of structure and how it operates. And this is something all new. And yes, financially it's a problem. Training-wise, it's a problem and an issue, but also in terms of planning out all these problems and hiccups. So I'm sure we're going to all be learning this in the process of it. And, we got to do a comparative analysis of how other states do it, for example.
And Trish, get some final thoughts from you. You're working in a college setting, and we're going to be talking to educators supporting students during this time in our next conversation. What have things been like for your students in the last couple of days?
There has been a level of stress among some of my students. I've had them come in to talk about other things, and then it devolves into the election. And I would say my female students in particular have concerns. They're concerned about something Susan has brought up, is reproductive rights and healthcare, but they're also concerned about graduating and sort of what kind of world are they going into when they graduate. I think it was just very problematic for me to listen over and over again how women were demeaned during this election, and the fact that we have these young people that we're teaching, that we have in the classroom, and you're trying to be optimistic and you're trying to encourage them. And it's very frustrating on my end when it's not what they're seeing in politics. I want to make sure that there's a place for them when they graduate. And I think that, it's a big job that I have to make sure that they understand that there is.
Well, I'm sure your students appreciate you being there for them, Trish. And Susan, really, really quickly here.
Yeah, I'm curious because I recently started teaching a communications course at Central Connecticut State University. And I was a little disappointed when I put out an announcement, please vote on Election Day. And I asked them yesterday, and I'm not sure out of a class of 26, anyone raised their hands if they voted. And I was sad about that. And I didn't understand why, with so many things at stake.
And that's another thing we certainly want to take a deep dive into. I want to thank our panel today. You've been listening to Susan Raff, who's a chief Capitol reporter at WFSB. Thanks, Susan, for being with us.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
And also Trish Crouse, who's a professor of political science at the University of New Haven. Trish, thanks for being with us as well.
Thank you.
And you're also listening to Jonathan Wharton, who's an associate professor of political science and urban affairs at Southern Connecticut State University. Jonathan, it was a pleasure having you on.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, ladies.
And for our listeners, you can join the conversation, 888-720-9677. Let us know if you have any questions or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. There have been a lot of unprecedented happenings over the last few years, but the stress of this election might feel overwhelming for some. And there's some research to back that up. 77% of adults said the future of the U.S. is a significant source of stress in their lives, and that's according to the American Psychological Association. What are you doing to manage stress this week? Krista on Facebook shared with us, I play Call of Duty. Yelling at characters in the video game is perfect. Well, Krista, thank you so much for sharing that with us. We might have to jump on that right after the show today. And for our listeners, same with Krista. If you want to share what you do to manage stress, we would love to hear it. 888-720-9677 or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. And here to join us to talk about it is Reverend Tracy Mehr-Muska, who's an assistant director in the Office of Religious and Spiritual Life at Wesleyan University and author of the book, Weathering the Storm, Simple Strategies for Being Peaceful and Prepared. Thank you so much, Tracy, for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
And also with us is Kate Diaz. She's a teacher at the Manchester School District and also president of the Connecticut Education Association. Kate, welcome back to Where We Live.
Thank you so much. There's a lot to talk about now.
Well, and you've both been listening to the conversation. Feel free to react. But Kate, I want to start with you by asking, how are you feeling this week? I imagine your students are pretty aware of what's happening and maybe want to talk about it.
So it's interesting. I think we've had a lot of educator response. I think with the political rhetoric being so strongly anti-public education, anti-labor, my teachers have really kind of had the first reaction. And then we're watching kind of the students process this. And this feels different than 2016. We've certainly had strong reactions from our LGBTQ plus community, our students kind of processing this and trying to see what is the space and what does this mean to them. And there's the normalcy of the school day that we try and utilize to kind of remind people that we put one foot in front of the other and we continue to do what we do. Because that's our role. We live in our community. We are impacted by national events, but we live every day in our schools, in our communities. And so to kind of anchor ourselves in that truth and the reality that we are going to manage sort of all of these outcomes on a very local level. And so how do we protect those local actions, those local spaces? And so a lot of that is really reassuring to children. And that I think some of what our educators are really focused on is, okay, we've had this election. It has happened. There's a lot of rhetoric that got kind of tossed around during this election cycle, which we should take seriously. But rhetoric and policy are different. Mm-hmm. And so how are we going to process this and not over-process it? Right? Not overreach.
Right.
And so balancing the sort of the authentic responses and how people are reacting, but keeping it, I think, in balance is really so critical. And that's what a lot of our educators are doing. Student walks into a math classroom, they're ready to do math. And we make space for a process. We make space for emotion and reality. But we also have an obligation to keep some sense of normalcy and to find that balance and help our students do that.
Well, and then, meeting the students where they're at too. We've heard a lot from adults what issues are top of mind for them. But what are some issues that students are concerned with that you're hearing?
Well, I think the uncertainty of okay, we've heard all this rhetoric, right? There's been the 2025, there's been sort of the assault on reproductive rights and some really aggressive language, particularly around transgender students and transgender individuals. And so I think, what does that mean? Right? What does that turn into in terms of action? And we always go to the worst case scenario, right? We're going to storm into the buildings and deport children, right? I think that is something that we wonder, well, what does strong, aggressive immigration policy look like for our undocumented students? And so there's panic about that. So we really have to process that in a way that says we can't respond to the things that haven't happened. And so we really want to say, listen, we are here to help. We are here to protect. We are here to care. And so one of the things we're going to do is we're not going to over-respond. And so really trying to draw that back and to go, okay, we heard a lot of rhetoric, but that doesn't necessarily mean those things we're going to roll right into our school. So let's take a deep breath, honor the fact that those things were in fact said. I'm never going to diminish that. Mm-hmm. But what's the practice that we're going to see? And this is a little different than 2016 because we have seen a Trump presidency. So there is a historical context. And so there is a little bit of anchoring of like, we didn't know what to expect in 2016. And I don't know that we know really what to expect today.
Sure.
But we at least have seen a Trump presidency. And so it's funny, my son is a senior in college. He's going to be a social studies teacher. He was up till 3:00 in the morning. He was following this. And he was the first to say to me, I am not going to be a doomsdayer. Mm-hmm. We have seen what this looks like. We know how to fight back. And so I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole of being a doomsdayer. And I thought, you know what, if my 22-year-old son, who is really so deeply ingrained in a lot of this conversation, is going to say this, then that is a real strong point to continue to kind of anchor and sit with. Like, we have a choice about how we respond, and we have that control. And let's use that to really moderate our response in a meaningful way and to teach our students to do that, right? Like, okay, guys, we're going to make space to process. We're going to make space to think these things through. We're not going to, a lot of our students don't want to do that in a general classroom.
Sure.
They don't want to do that. Mm-hmm. So we encourage our students, like, find those trusted adults, find those, there's clubs, there's activities, there's spaces where students have developed really good relationships. That's where we're finding they want to have those conversations with trusted adults, with trusted peers. Mm-hmm. And we're really encouraging our young people to turn it into action. When Susan talks about them not voting, that's disheartening. So how do we take our 16 and 17-year-olds who are processing this and turn them into active voters and participants and remind them that the real response to this in the long haul is engagement, making sure you're at the table.
Well, I'm hearing a lot of anchoring, and sounds like a lot of helping students and young people in general feel grounded when we're in a state of sort of uncertainty, as you mentioned. And Tracy, I imagine your conversations with students are maybe a little similar.
Yes. Yeah. Kate brought up a lot of really good points. Two additional things I wanted to highlight was also a sense of hurt that some students are feeling because potentially maybe they are from a historically minoritized community, and a sense of taking it personally. It's hard not to take some of the rhetoric personally when we're hearing it. And also, I'm noticing some anger, maybe that they've been let down by the voters, and also some damaged social connections. Maybe their families aren't necessarily aligned with their own political worldviews, and that's a grief for students as well to deal with.
Well, I've heard from a young person recently that it's a grieving process, as you mentioned. It's almost like they are mourning for many things, and it feels like that's not really a word that I usually associate with an election cycle, but it certainly is something that I'm hearing a lot, both in my professional and personal life. So it feels like this time around, you can't really compare it to another election cycle that we've seen. So how do we manage this kind of anxiety during these times of the word uncertainty is a theme, I think, and when we don't know what the answer is and we can't solve the issues tomorrow, how can we help young people manage that?
Sure. So some of the advice I've been giving is both inward focused and outward focused. So in terms of inward focused ways that we can care for ourselves, we can really focus on gratitude, and that may sound paradoxical right now, especially if we're grieving or angry or afraid or scared or hurt. But there are positive things we can point to. There are micro joys that people can discover, and trying to center on those things, not in denying some of the concerns, but alongside of those concerns. I encourage students to participate in self-care activities. And I hate the word self-care.
We've talked about that. We've decided to go with personal care.
There you go.
Yes, I like to use the word stress mitigation because these are practices that help us mitigate stress. Sure. And whether that be mindfulness practices, just centering on the present moment, getting rest, doing fun, life-giving activities, maintaining your routine, as Kate said. A third thing is social media. It's just trying to manage our consumption of social media and the news. We do have a civic responsibility to be informed. And also, we may need to set limits with ourselves just for our own well-being. And in terms of outward-oriented things, the first is really, I think, about people, connecting with people that give us joy and life and hope, connecting with communities that support us, who appreciate who we are, who love us as we are, setting boundaries with those people who may not be as supportive and who may make us question ourselves. A second thing is, as Kate said, just getting engaged, figuring out how we can plug in, figuring out what it is that we do have control over. And finally, I hope students and adults and everyone will reach out if they need help. There are some amazing hotlines. There are what they call warm lines, which are just places that people can reach out and just talk to someone who wants to provide support and listen.
And I want to say, with that in mind too, because I do have a question here that was actually inspired by a conversation that I had with a friend, that, you know, when the moment she realized what was happening, she says she dreaded seeing the silver lining posts on social media, and she just wants to have a moment to be sad. What are your thoughts about that, Tracy? Is it okay for us to kind of sit there and be sad and wallow in this for a moment?
Absolutely. And that is necessary. I think what we can do alongside of that is, for instance, with Viktor Frankl, he found goodness in humanity. He found moments of joy, and that helped him survive some unimaginable times during the Holocaust, for instance. So, yes, take time to grieve. Don't deny feelings. And also, if there are ways we can practice gratitude, maybe with a gratitude journal, or through a mindfulness practice, or spending time with people that make us feel good, that doesn't necessarily diminish the reality of the feelings. It's something we can do alongside of them.
Kate?
I think that it's been very interesting to process this. I mean, I know myself personally, I woke up and I just sort of sat there. And I remember my husband looked at me and he's like, so, all right. And I looked at him and I said, you know, I am a public educator and a labor leader, two things that have been resoundingly attacked, and I am concerned, and I'm not okay. And so I kind of sat with that, and I said, okay, I'm not okay, and that's just going to be normal, and that's part of it. But then I think for a person like me, and everybody I think has to deal with this in a way that supports them. I needed to turn that into, so what can I do? Where are the spaces I can push into? You know, and I really started to think about, okay, how do I protect these things, public education, labor, that are important to me, that I believe have incredible value to not just the educators, but the students, the community. So what am I going to do? And so I started to really contextualize and go, okay, where are my places of action and support? And how do I encourage other people? You know, if you're in a religious community, what kind of safe spaces are you building and inviting people into? Are you part of the League of Women Voters? Where is it, you know, are you part of your town councils, town committees, you know, Chamber of Commerce? Are you looking to those spaces to be affirming of the values you believe are in your community? And the election is gone and done. That's over. That has happened. But that is not the end of the story. It is a piece of a story. And reminding everybody that we can be influential in very personal, close spaces that make a big, big difference. And then I think when I was ready, and I think, you know, there is a readiness to this, because I didn't want the silver lining posts either. I was not, and I stayed off social media pretty much all day yesterday because I had no interest. I wasn't ready for it. But when I started to want to feed the it's going to be okay moment, because I needed to do that, I looked to the places where there were wins, because I care about the political wins, where we saw things defeated, where we saw positive things occur. You know, we had a state that elected a transgender person to Congress in the midst of all of this. And so understanding that there were bright spots, and talking about Board of Education elections where we saw really positive things happen, and looking on the global, you know, the sort of the national landscape, and realizing that there were certain things that happened that were disheartening to me. Mm-hmm. And then there were other places where I saw activism winning. And I thought, well, okay, so there's balance in this. And so being open to seeing that when you're ready, I think starts to feed your sense of what's the path forward.
And of course, I'm hearing a lot of engagement and turning that into action, especially for younger people. And this really pertains to everyone, really. And Tracy, earlier you mentioned talking about, you know, being informed of what's happening, but that engagement can also be overwhelming in of itself, and that leads to the need for personal care, right? So, can you talk about, you know, how do you balance the want to be informed? because for many people, that's the way they can take action. But by being informed, especially with the amount of information that we're exposed to these days, it can be a lot. So how do you find that balance in terms of, okay, I'm getting all this information now, when is a good time to take a step back?
I think the answer for that is dependent on each individual.
Right.
And then each person really being in tune with their body, be in tune with their sense of well-being. And when there's a recognition that the fatigue and the compassion fatigue and the worry are becoming too much, then being mindful about taking a break. And as I said, being in community is essential, I think, for any sort of activism or engagement, because we strengthen each other, we encourage each other. When one of us is feeling overwhelmed, another might be the one to take up the mantle for a time. So just really being in tune with one's own needs is my invitation.
I think also we have to take care of each other. I have a colleague who is very empathetic, and everybody sort of unloads on this person. And so I went to her yesterday and I said, you might need a timeout. I said, because I'm worried. I know that a lot of people are kind of unloading their emotional stress on you. And I'm very worried that that's going to become a lot for you to carry. When one person after another talks about their sort of response to this election and how they are feeling. And so I think it's really important that we pay attention to each other and that we do take a moment to go, how about let's go for a walk? I feel like you're really kind of getting a lot here. Let's go for a walk, take a deep breath. And I think it's easy for us to help other people do that, because sometimes we don't do it for ourselves. And so being very aware of each other, I think, is super important. And the people that you know well, really care for them and check in. We're not used to necessarily always doing that, right? We're we kind of always sort of roll with particularly in education, we are, there's a lot of stressors. We're used to that level of stress. But there is a moment where we do have to kind of look at each other and go, okay, wait a minute. Have we, are we reaching that point where we're like, okay, we need to have a good laugh. We need to take a break from the intensity of all of, this. Let's go play pickleball. I don't know what it is, whatever it is that works, right? Would you like to go down the YouTube rabbit hole of cat memes? I don't know. But something that breaks the intensity, I think, is really critical because if it just builds,
right,
it starts to feel overwhelming and insurmountable. And so breaking that intensity of pressure is really important. And I couldn't agree more that I have to time out myself on social media. I have to edit because I am a consumer. I'm a person that wants it all. And so I have to edit. And I think it's important to do that.
Well, we appreciate the reminder to take a break, and hopefully this conversation will spark our listeners to take a moment, go out, take a walk, breathe some fresh air. You've been listening to Kate Diaz, who's a teacher at Manchester School District, and you've also been listening to Reverend Tracy Mehr-Muska, who's an assistant director in the Office of Religious and Spiritual Life at Wesleyan University. Let us know if you have any tips for us to manage our stress or for other people's stress. Here at Connecticut Public, we've been taking a lot of walks and doing our best to stay hydrated to the delight of our guests today. Let us know if you have any tips for us, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. It's hard to disconnect from the news. There's a need for some of us to stay connected and informed on what's unfolding. But our guests today say that even for us journalists, it's important to take breaks, and I fully recognize the irony that we are on a news program right now. Still with us is Reverend Dr. Tracy Mehr-Muska, who's with the Wesleyan University, and also Kate Diaz, who is the president of Connecticut Education Association. So we've been talking about ways to de-stress, things like taking a walk or playing a game and whatnot, or checking in with your friends and family. And Tracy, when we think about staying connected, this could be really important, but can you talk about it's also very important to connect with people who you feel you're safe with?
Yes, and I think what's so tricky about this election in particular is that maybe the people who were our go-to people are people that we now no longer necessarily feel aligned with on this specific issue. So there really does maybe need to be a purposeful reorientation of who are those people? Who can you talk to right now about this? Who will support you and make you feel more comfortable and more safe. So I think that's what makes this especially challenging, is maybe our existing support systems aren't working as well, and we may need to look to new people and new communities for that kind of support.
And with that idea in mind too, Kate, earlier you talked about potentially giving some normalcy for students, but there are students who want to talk about it, so meeting them where they're at. But how do you respond to those that say that these discussions should just be avoided in the classroom?
So I think that students bring in, classrooms are dynamic spaces. Students bring in their ideas, their thoughts. And I think there has to be a certain amount of this that teachers need to be prepared to navigate, in the sense that, we know that kids are going to say things. And so we do have to have a little bit of practice in saying, you know what, I appreciate your sentiment on that, and figuring out how to either embrace a conversation in a way that is acceptable, that honors sort of the idea of dialogue, and also be willing to say, you know what, I appreciate that you're really feeling that right now, but we're not going to actually have that conversation here. Like, that's not what we're doing in this space. And to really be able to set those boundaries in place while honoring the fact that they may want to talk about things, they actually aren't in control of that classroom, and that you as the teacher are, and you're going to make the decisions about appropriateness. And we do talk about this as educators. We do sort of plan for it. We have the conversation about what's appropriate, what's not, and how do we transition if something potentially goes kind of awry.
Right. So we got about 2 minutes here, but Tracy, I do want to touch on, you've written a book on resilience called Weathering the Storm. Can you give our listeners some tips on working to become more resilient, as we talk about, de-stressing and personal care, but there's something really important about being resilient.
Yes. And what I hope listeners will hear is that resilience is not something that you're born with or not born with, but it is a set of characteristics that we can cultivate. And cultivating them can be really fun, whether it's having coffee with a friend, or finding a sense of purpose, or engaging in some gratitude practices. So the actual practice of building resilience can be fun, and it's something that we're invited to do day in and day out, whether we're in the middle of a political firestorm or during even the easy times.
And Kate, about 30 seconds, final thoughts for listeners?
I think that resilience is a great theme. And I think it's something we in education value highly. And, it's a great way to focus yourselves to kind of find a path forward.
Well, I'm excited to hear that it's a fun thing to do, because I think oftentimes we hear it as something that's very challenging and hard to do. So I think that's very heartening for us, and hopefully for our listeners as well. We want to thank Reverend Dr. Tracy Mehr-Muska, who's the Assistant Director in the Office of Religious Spiritual Life at Wesleyan University. Thank you so much, Tracy, for being with us
Thanks
today.
for having me.
And also Kate Diaz, who's a teacher at the Manchester School District and is also the president of the Connecticut Education Association. Thank you so much for sharing your experience with us today.
Happy to do it.
I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. Thank you so much for listening, and we here all hope you take care of yourself.